There is a type of soil found throughout the Amazon basin that should not exist. It is dark, almost black, in a region where the natural soil is a pale, nutrient-poor clay the color of rust. It is extraordinarily fertile in a place where the surrounding earth can barely sustain agriculture for more than a season or two before it collapses. It contains charcoal, bone fragments, broken pottery, and a microbial density that modern agricultural scientists have spent decades trying to replicate in laboratories and have not, in any complete sense, succeeded. The indigenous people of the region call it Terra preta, literally dark earth. Scientists call it Amazonian dark earth, and it is found not in one place, not in two, but scattered across an area of the Amazon basin estimated at somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 square kilometers. Patches of it sit beneath the canopy at irregular intervals, like stepping stones across a landscape that has no obvious reason to contain them. The conventional understanding of the Amazon describes it as one of the last great wildernesses on Earth, a vast, largely undisturbed ecosystem that developed over millions of years without significant human modification. And in many ways, that understanding is correct. The Amazon is ancient, complex, and irreplaceable. But the soil says something else. And the soil, unlike a theory, does not require interpretation. Terra preta is not simply rich soil. It is, in the assessment of soil scientists who have studied it carefully, one of the most productive agricultural substrates ever identified. Unlike conventional compost or enriched earth, which depletes over time, Terra preta appears to be self-renewing. The microbial communities within it regenerate the organic material that agriculture removes, maintaining the soil's fertility across centuries and possibly millennia without external inputs. The mechanism is not fully understood. What is known is that the soil was created. It did not form naturally. Its composition, the particular combination of charcoal produced by low-temperature burning, of organic waste, of broken ceramic fragments that appear in almost every sample, is the signature of a deliberate and sustained human practice. Someone made this soil. Many people, over a very long time, in a great many places, made this soil. The dating of Terra preta deposits places their formation at various points between approximately 450 BC and 950 AD, though some samples have returned dates that push further in both directions. The practice of creating it, in other words, was not a single event or a brief cultural moment. It was a continuous, multi-generational activity conducted across an area larger than France and Germany combined by a population whose size and organization we are only beginning to dimly comprehend. And this is the point at which the conventional picture of the pre-Columbian Amazon begins to develop a quiet but significant tension with the evidence beneath the ground. For most of the 20th century, the prevailing scientific consensus about the Amazon before European contact was relatively straightforward. The forest was essentially pristine wilderness, too poor in soil nutrients and too hostile in climate to support large, complex human populations. The groups who did live there were assumed to be small, nomadic, or semi-nomadic, living in modest numbers without the kind of social organization that produces permanent settlements, monumental architecture, or landscape-scale modification. This consensus was not unreasonable. The Amazon's native soils are genuinely poor. The heat, humidity, and biological competition make sustained agriculture extremely difficult, and the European explorers and naturalists who moved through the region in the centuries following contact found by and large scattered and relatively small communities living in apparent simplicity. But there was a complicating detail that took a surprisingly long time to receive serious attention. The first European expedition to navigate the entire length of the Amazon River, led by Francisco de Orellana in 1541 and 1542, produced an account written by a Dominican friar named Gaspar de Carvajal that described something quite different from the sparse wilderness the later consensus assumed. Carvajal wrote of dense populations lining the riverbanks for miles at a stretch. He described towns so large and so close together that they appeared from the river to form a single continuous settlement. He described roads, plazas, elaborately decorated ceramics, and what appeared to be organized political authority extending across vast territories. He described, in short, a civilization. For centuries, this account was largely dismissed as exaggeration, the inflated imagination of a 16th century friar in an unfamiliar world. And it may have contained exaggerations, but it is now increasingly being reconsidered. In 2008, a team of researchers led by archaeologist Martti Parssinen published a paper documenting the discovery of hundreds of geometric earthworks in the Brazilian state of Acre, in the southwestern Amazon, in a region where the forest had been partially cleared for cattle ranching. The earthworks, ditches, embankments, and enclosures forming precise geometric shapes had been invisible beneath the forest canopy for centuries. They appeared only when the trees were removed. The structures are large. Some of the enclosures measure 200 meters or more across. They are arranged in circles, squares, and octagons with a geometric regularity that leaves no ambiguity about their origin. They are not natural formations. They were built.
The dating of the Acre earthworks places their construction between roughly 1000 BC and 1250 AD. There are, as of the most recent surveys, more than 500 of them identified in Acre alone, and Acre is one state in one corner of a basin that covers more than 5 million square kilometers. The LiDAR surveys that began in earnest in the 2010s, airborne laser scanning technology that can map the ground surface beneath dense forest canopy, have progressively expanded the scale of what is being found. In 2008, a major survey published in the journal Nature reported the identification of more than 80 ancient settlements in the Bolivian Amazon, connected by a network of causeways and roads extending across an area of more than 4,000 square kilometers. The settlements range from small villages to what the researchers described as urban centers, places with civic architecture, central plazas, and evidence of dense, sustained habitation. The archaeologist who led that survey, Heiko Prumers, described the scale of what he was seeing as comparable to ancient cultures in the Andes or Mesoamerica. He noted that the sheer size and organization of the settlements required rethinking fundamental assumptions about Amazonian population density and social complexity.
But Terra preta and geometric earthworks, striking as they are, may be the least subtle aspect of what the Amazon is beginning to reveal. There is a line of research developed over the last 2 decades by botanists, ecologists, and anthropologists working at the intersection of their fields that suggests the composition of the Amazon forest itself may reflect a long history of human management. Not farming in any conventional sense, not the clearing of trees and the planting of rows, but something more distributed, more patient, and in its own way more ambitious. A study published in 2013 in the journal Science found that plant species known to have been domesticated or actively used by indigenous Amazonian peoples, species like Brazil nuts, acai palms, cacao, rubber, and dozens of others, are significantly and consistently overrepresented in the forest near known archaeological sites. The pattern is not random. The closer you are to a site of ancient human activity, the more likely you are to find the forest dominated by species that humans found useful. One of the study's lead authors, the archaeobotanist Carolina Levis, described the finding carefully. She was not suggesting that the entire Amazon was planted. She was observing that the distribution of certain species across millions of square kilometers of supposedly wild forest appears to reflect, in some meaningful way, the preferences and activities of the people who lived within it. The forest, in this reading, is not simply a place where people lived. It is, to some degree, a place that people shaped. How many people would be required to shape a forest of 5 million square kilometers across 2,000 years is a calculation that produces numbers that are, depending on your prior assumptions, either plausible or astonishing. The pre-Columbian population of the Amazon basin is one of the most contested questions in the historical demography of the Americas. For most of the 20th century, estimates tended toward the conservative, a few million people perhaps, spread thinly across the basin, living in small and largely isolated groups. These estimates were partly based on the carrying capacity of Amazonian soils, and partly on what European observers found in the centuries after contact, which was by then a dramatically reduced and disrupted population. That disruption is the key variable that conservative estimates have historically underweighted. European contact with the Americas brought diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, to which indigenous populations had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity. The mortality rates produced by these epidemics in the first century or two of contact were, in the assessment of most modern scholars, catastrophic beyond easy comprehension. Some regions lost 70, 80, 90% of their populations within a generation or two of first contact. When later European explorers moved through the Amazon and found small scattered groups in a vast, relatively empty forest, they were not, in all likelihood, seeing what the forest had looked like in 1491. They were seeing the aftermath. The silence they encountered was not the forest's natural state, it was the silence of recent, enormous loss. The anthropologist Charles Mann, in his book 1491, argued that the Amazon encountered by Europeans in the 16th and 17th centuries may have been in the early stages of ecological recovery from a demographic collapse so severe that the forest itself was actively regrowing over abandoned settlements and managed landscapes. The wilderness in this reading was not ancient, it was new. Or rather, it was a second growth, a forest returning to places that had, within living memory of some of its oldest inhabitants, been something quite different. The LiDAR surveys currently underway across the Amazon basin have covered, in total, a fraction of the total area. The technology is expensive, the logistics are complex, and the political and bureaucratic frameworks governing archaeological research in multiple countries add layers of difficulty to an already demanding undertaking. Progress is real but slow.
What the surveys have found in every region where they have been applied with sufficient resolution is evidence of human modification, not in isolated pockets, not in the areas that archaeologists already suspected, but consistently across diverse regions in forests that were assumed to be pristine. Roads, enclosures, mounds, causeways, agricultural terraces, fish weirs, and the persistent dark signature of Terra preta beneath the root systems of trees that no living person planted. The archaeologist Anna Roosevelt, who has spent decades working at the site of Marajo Island at the mouth of the Amazon, has documented what she describes as one of the most complex pre-Columbian societies in the Americas, a culture that built large ceremonial mounds, produced sophisticated ceramics, and sustained a population that she estimates at hundreds of thousands on an island alone. Roosevelt has argued for years that the Amazon was far more densely populated and socially complex than mainstream archaeology was prepared to acknowledge. The field is moving in her direction. Slowly, peer-reviewed paper by peer-reviewed paper, the picture that emerges is of a basin that was, before contact, more populated, more organized, more architecturally ambitious, and more ecologically managed than any previous consensus had suggested. The picture is still incomplete. It will be incomplete for a long time. The forest is very large, and the ground is very deep, and the majority of what lies beneath it has not yet been seen. There is a useful way to think about the scale of what archaeology has found in the Amazon and what it implies about what has not yet been found. The city of Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, Missouri, was at its peak around 1100 AD, one of the largest cities in the pre-Columbian Americas north of Mexico. It covered an area of roughly 14 square kilometers and may have had a population of 20,000 people or more. It is considered a major archaeological site, a significant monument to the complexity of pre-Columbian North American civilization. The settlement complexes identified in the Bolivian Amazon in 2018 cover, as noted, more than 4,000 square kilometers. They are connected by roads. They contain multiple sites of urban scale. They represent a level of social organization and territorial integration that, if found anywhere in the Old World, would be discussed as a major civilization, studied, named, placed in textbooks beside Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley. They are, for the most part, still not in the textbooks. They are still in the journal articles. They are still being processed by a field that is, understandably, moving carefully. And they cover 4,000 square kilometers out of 5 million. There is a particular kind of vertigo that comes from realizing that a place you thought you understood is in fact something quite different from what you were told. The Amazon rainforest is one of the most studied ecosystems on Earth. Thousands of scientists have worked within it, cataloged its species, measured its carbon, mapped its rivers. It is, in the conventional sense, known. And yet beneath the canopy, in the darkness below the root systems of trees that have grown for centuries over ground that was once cleared and planted and shaped and built upon, there are roads no modern person has walked, enclosures no modern person has mapped, and a dark, fertile soil that should not be there, produced by hands that belong to a history we have barely begun to read. The forest is not a wilderness that people moved through. It may be, in some meaningful and still largely unexamined sense, a place that people made, tended across generations with a patience and a scale of collective intention that has no obvious parallel in any civilization we currently recognize as such. What happened to the people who made it? The epidemics are part of the answer. The disruptions of contact are part of the answer. But the full shape of what was lost, how many people, how many cities, how many generations of accumulated knowledge about how to live within and alongside and through a forest of this complexity, that shape has not yet been recovered. It may be that what we call the Amazon wilderness is in a sense we are only beginning to grasp, a monument, not to the absence of human civilization in this part of the world, but to its presence, a presence so large, so sustained, and so thoroughly erased that the forest grew back over it, and we looked at the forest and called it empty, and assumed that it had always been that way. And the question that remains, the one the LiDAR surveys will keep producing year by year, site by site, for as long as the work continues, is not whether people live there. They did. The soil remembers. The question is how many and what they built, and how much of it is still there, 1 more meter beneath the surface, waiting for the light to finally reach it.